they're trap fishermen. So they'd fish with traps and they would go out every day and throw their old bait out of their traps. And the sharks would show up. So these sharks, as soon as they would get there, before they even started to pull their traps, the sharks would be gathering around their boat. So this fisherman was telling me it's really interesting. I could go out and he'd rev his engine, it slow his boat down to pick up a trap. Sharks would be there. So he had a problem with his boat. It turns out his engine died. He had to replace his engine. So he went out as soon as his engine was replaced to the same spots and no sharks. So then it took about 2 or 3 weeks before the sharks began to recognize it was his engine. So then I asked him, well, when you're out fishing, was there anybody else around you? And he said, yeah, there'd always be people. There was another group that would take people snorkeling a little while over. I said, well, they ever see sharks? He said, no. So I said, well, that's interesting. It sounds like the sharks could recognize the sound of your engine. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly what he thought it was. And when he changed engines, same boat, same practice, same place, sharks didn't recognize him. And of course, there were all these other boats around that were creating noise, but there wasn't a reward that came with the noise.
Right.
So what was interesting was the sharks had to relearn that there's a new sound that's now associated with I'm going to get a treat when this guy shows up.
And welcome again to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here speaking as your host. Before we get into it here with Chris, I want to take this time as usual, just for the regular listener, you know what we're about by now, obviously. We've been at it for 4 years and the not-for-profit for 13 years, so 4 years on the podcast. We also are a charity, so for anybody listening here that wants to help donate to the cause, we're self-funded and also funded by donors. You can just go to our website, behindgreatness.org, and there you'll find a growing and ever-growing library of conversations we've been having with people all around the world, experts and not, scientists and artists, entrepreneurs, corporate leaders, because we just want to get down to learning what other people have been spending their lives learning at the edge of their capabilities. And, we're just going to do the same today as well. So in that way, we're kind of predictable. I think in that way, that's the only way we're predictable. But what really shines the light here is that we've been growing organically, and it's because of you, listener, that we keep doing this. Again, we all volunteer our time. So thank you for your auditory companionship. Don't forget to review, share, comment, like, whatever it is that you can do for us on that side. Please feel free. We remain appreciative. So enough of me and enough of that. Let's get right into it, like I said, with Chris. So today we're joined by a special guest. His name is Chris Lowe, Dr. Chris Lowe. He joins us from California State University, Long Beach. Chris has been studying sharks, rays, and bony fishes for over 30 years, focusing on their behavior, physiology, and ecology. For the last 15 years, he and his students have been studying juvenile white sharks off the coast of Southern California. Using a wide array of technology, they have found that white sharks use Southern California beaches seasonally as nursery habitat for their young. This brings juvenile white sharks in close proximity to beachgoers. Chris and his students use a wide array of technologies and educators to help lifeguards and the public understand the mysterious lives of sharks and just how much of a treat they may actually pose. You can find Chris as well through the California State University Long Beach website within the Shark Lab, which is something that he founded. We'll talk about that too. Welcome to the program, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
I loved sharks when I was a kid. Loved them. I was never really into having a pet. Dogs are cute. Kittens were cute. Going back to when I was 5, 6, 7. I didn't want to fish. I didn't want birds. But I think I was about 9, 10 maybe. And we were at the pet store because we used to always like going to the pet store, me and my brothers, at the local shopping mall, just to see the animals. And there was, for the first time, I saw a baby shark, a sandbar shark in this tank. And that's the only thing I could think about for weeks. Tried to convince my parents to get a shark. Like I went straight for shark. Forget puppies and kids. I went straight for shark. Of course, they said no. But I don't know why. I'll always, yeah, go figure. They say no, a shark in the house. Uh, I'll always remember viewing the shark because I viewed it. And sorry, I mean boring, maybe boring for everybody else, not for me. But last thing here, because I think it was really important for me. I can't lose the memory of that shark because I was only 9 or 10. So I was looking up at this aquarium and I was looking at the underside of this shark. So I saw its mouth, its teeth, and it looked down on me. It had these like alien eyes. And it was just so, I was enraptured by this thing, just enraptured. So here's my question to you. Why sharks?
Yeah. So, I grew up on an island, small island, and there was really not much else to do but do something in the ocean. So my grandfather's a commercial fisherman. His uncles were whalers. So I came from a long family of fishermen. And I fished all the time as a kid. Like I don't remember learning how to swim and I don't remember learning how to fish. I just remember doing it. And then one day, probably around that same age, around 9, I caught a fish I hadn't caught before, and it was a dogfish. I was a horrible student. I didn't know what this thing was, and I decided because on the way back from fishing was the town library. So I actually had to go to the library, almost knocked the librarian over, seeing me walk into that building. And I said, I need a book on fish. I caught a fish. I don't know what it is. So she took me to that section and I found a book on sharks. And that was it. Between looking at that thing and going, that is so different from the thousands of other fish that I've caught, which I knew what they were, but this thing was different. And when I found that book and I started looking through that book, I began to realize these things are very different. And that started it for me. So then I kind of became obsessed. I totally kind of got into reading books about sharks, all kinds of books that I could find. And a lot in the early days were about shark attacks. But I combed through those looking for like, what's about these animals? What's the deal with these things? So that kind of got me started. And then I thought, maybe I'll be this thing called a marine biologist. And when I mentioned it to my parents, they're like, is that a paying job? Do you get paid to do that? I said, I don't know. I don't really care, but it sounds pretty cool. And I want to learn more about fish. So that's kind of how it started.
Your mom's family has been in Martha's Vineyard and has been in the fishing business for the last 250 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're one of the original families on the island. And, generation after generation grew up there and they were either farmers or fishermen or whalers.
You said sharks are the new dinosaurs.
Well, so interestingly enough, my wife is a marine mammologist. So she studies seals. So when we got our jobs as professors at Long Beach in the marine biology department, it was a battle between the two of us to see who would attract the most students. So when we first started, 25 years ago, I would say it was a 50-50 split. Half of them were interested in dolphins, whales. The other half was interested in sharks. And when we would talk to students about why they want to be a marine biologist, they would say, well, as a kid, I was interested in dinosaurs, but they're not around anymore. So now my new interest is sharks or dolphins. And I would say probably in the last 10 years, sharks have now surpassed dolphins. They've surpassed dinosaurs. I think more kids are interested in sharks than those other animals. And a lot, if you look in the literature, it's really interesting because there are hundreds of books written about sharks. They're probably the most written about animal on the planet.
Really?
Yep. So there's an appeal there, and that appeal has kind of evolved and grown over time. And I have a lot of interesting theories as to why. But again, I'm just a lowly biologist. But when I talk to my psychology friends, I learn a lot about, why people probably have this strange, morbid interest in sharks.
Well, let's go. Let's talk. So tell me about these theories. Go.
I think it comes back to our hunter-gatherer days, right? So, in the old days, people would go out, they would have to catch their own food, and there were a lot of big predators around. So you always risked getting killed or eaten yourself, right? So when hunters would go out and they would come back and they would tell stories about the things that they would see, quite often if they saw something dangerous and menacing, they would tell stories about those things,
Mm,
back at the fire or whatever.
sure.
And people would listen intently, mainly because it could be something that would save their lives. Humans are one of the few animals that have the ability to convey information about something we've seen or experienced that someone else had never experienced before, but could use that information to actually save them. So, in other words, the more vividly we tell those stories, our brains kind of pick up on that. And the more dangerous it sounds, the more likely we are to listen and retain that information.
Hmm.
So, what's really interesting about this phenomenon is that by the time sharks really became an important animal in terms of being injurious to humans, in other words, humans started spending more time in the ocean, they were already fished down to the point where the likelihood of people encountering sharks wasn't that great. So, and then we're talking like mid 1800s by this time, right? So they had already been fished out, the big ones, and people would kill them just because they viewed them as being dangerous. So, what's really interesting is you don't have to see an animal to paint a picture about it, or at least get that mental picture in your head. So, people would come back and they would tell these stories about these sharks. A sailor had fallen in the water, a fisherman had fallen in the water, and the sharks devoured them. So what happens is the people on land might never actually get to experience a shark because they were gone or they would never get out to sea. So what that meant was the stories could be embellished upon. It was easy to exaggerate the stories to make them
Sure.
more funny. Because even if you're a horrible storyteller, people were more likely to pay attention to you if you could make it more crazy. So what happened was, I think in the early days, sharks got painted with this, kind of menacing brush, even though in reality, we really knew nothing about them. And the fact that occasionally people were bitten and killed by them was still rare, even back when sharks were abundant. But nonetheless, most people never had an opportunity to actually see a shark. So therefore, it was the stories that shaped their perceptions. Now we flash forward, here we are, 100 years later, and you can simply watch a television show or series and you get the same kind of storytelling, painting the same kind of picture, which means we're kind of perpetuating that perception. So remember, all this comes down to our basic anatomy. We love being scared. Being scared, you get that little shot of dopamine, that little shot of happy juice from being scared. And and there's a reason why it's been so hard to change this perception of sharks because we kind of like it.
Like a serial killer series. We kind of
It's
like it. We
really
shouldn't.
exactly. Now, but there are examples. The more people encounter these things and the more they don't resemble the stories,
Yeah.
and they begin to go, wait a minute, those that doesn't make sense anymore. So you can actually deprogram people the same way. So I'll give you an example. Probably one of the best examples is if you were to walk down, say, the streets in New Bedford or in San Pedro back in the late 1800s, and you were to ask anybody on the street what they thought about whales,
Hmm.
what do you think they would say?
They're huge monsters in the sea.
And they killed people. They're
Yeah.
horrible. They're demonic, right?
Yeah.
Think of Moby Dick. Think of the
Sure.
picture painted by Herman Melville, right? So, but that was because those people never actually saw a whale. They were gone. And the only things they would learn about whales were the stories that whalers would tell when they would come back to land. And family members would not return from a trip. And they would say, oh, they were killed by the whale. So it painted this picture in their heads. Okay. So by the early 1900s, whales are gone. The
Hmm.
people who are out hunting for them are now in factory ships shooting harpoon guns that nobody was ever killing whales. It was easy to just go out and harvest them. So then what happened is in the 70s, right before the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in the US, because all those species were on the road to extinction, was they got a major PR makeover. So
Hmm.
whales went from being these demonic animals like the Herman Melville's Moby Dick to, you know what, they're mammals like us. They have fur, they have little eyelashes, they nurse their young, they're highly communicative, they have very large brains, they're highly social, they have, family units.
You and I did discuss about several other skill sets that you find important for scientists, especially modern science, like now. And you did say you prefaced that kind of discussion, or that part of the discussion with me, by telling me, and the only reason why I remember this is because one of my own sons right now is studying life sciences, so he's actually going through this in his own undergraduate career, like going through the learning of the importance of this. So it was a small trigger, right? You said scientists have given up the need to prove work or their work in the public sphere. And so they let others do that work for them. And that reminded me, of course, on how I was educated on sharks. And that was through a movie series that was globally popular, but that demonized the sharks and nothing else. And that's stayed with me. I'm like, I'm middle-aged now. And that is my first impression of sharks. Why have scientists given up the need to prove their work? Or is that something that's always been the case? Given up to prove their work in public.
Right. I think what happened was there was a time when scientists were just, when I train my students, I push them. I'm like, we have a language. We have all these technical terms that we have to use, and they have very specific meanings, and you're going to have to learn these words. And anytime you're talking to a fellow scientist, that way they'll understand you. We can be more literal. We can be more specific. And what happened over time was when it came time to translate some really complex idea or theory, we would go, well, it's too complicated. So we would rely on other people to make that translation for us to the general public. And then scientists would get actually pissed off because they would go, well, that's actually not what that means. You didn't do a very good job of interpreting it. So what happened was in the early days of, the way scientists were trained was we almost isolated ourselves from the rest of the population, right? We were off in our little world and studying our thing. And some of it might have been pure in its science, and some of it might have been implied in its science. But we thought, whatever we do, we'll present to the world and they can do whatever they want with it. Today, that doesn't necessarily work that way. The reason why we think we get less funding today is because when we look back, we realize we missed that very important step of being able, the people who generated the work, to be able to find ways to communicate that to the public so they would understand the importance of it. And that actually is a little difficult because of the way we're trained. So we're trained to be specific and literal, and it's all about the data, and you got to drill in. But what we now do as scientists, what I do with all my students, is I say, look, grandma, who probably isn't a scientist, you need to tell her why you're doing what you're doing and explain the importance. How are you going to do that? So, and you can't use your big words because she doesn't have 12 years of college to learn this vocabulary, right?
Sure.
So how do you do it? And it turns out it just takes a little bit of practice. It takes a little bit of somebody pushing them and poking them, saying, you can't use that word. That's too technical. What's an analogy that you could use for the system that anybody in the population might be able to relate to? And with a little practice, they're able to do that. But remember, this is what I call drill in, zoom out. So we focus on training scientists to drill in.
Yeah.
And now what we need to do is practice getting them to zoom out.
Yeah.
And then
ask back.
Exactly. And then they have to use their own words to describe in more simpler terms, something that could be seemingly incredibly complex. But with a little practice, they're able to do it. And that will change how the public treats scientists.
Let's bring that home with a story that you've given. So thank you. And you did share a story, and you ended off with the lesson that you just started off with is doing the science or communicating the science to the public, not the managers. Mm-hmm. And so that was a lesson that you told me coming out of this story, but you're doing work for fisheries. Do you remember this, what you shared with me about the bloating fish?
In my early stages of my career, I did a lot of fisheries work, mainly because there was funding. So we were working on a project and we were asking questions about these fish that you catch at depth, because they have this little air bladder inside their body. And that air bladder is under pressure of the water and the atmosphere. When you bring that fish up, that air expands really rapidly.
Hmm.
And it can actually make the fish look dead. And it can cause its stomach to push out of its mouth and its eyes to pop out of its head. All these horrible things cause from what we call barotrauma. So it's pressure related trauma. So we thought, okay, this species or this group of fish, normally for most populations, managers would say, if a fisherman catches a fish under a reproductive size, like it's not mature yet, we're going to make him put it back so it can grow up, at least spawn once to help keep its population growing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with this species, fishers have fished down all the big ones, and now we're fishing babies, basically. And those babies would come up and they would look dead. So we decided we would do this work to discover basically how detrimental is this fish. And we found that, believe it or not, if you recompress them, if you just push them back down underwater and you take them back, maybe 40 or 50 feet, all that gas recompresses and the fish miraculously comes alive and can survive that. So we were so excited because we found that over 80% of the fish that experienced this actually survived. And we thought, this is perfect.
It's huge.
Now these managers can use these data to say, we're going to set a minimum size limit for this group of fish, and this will help the population grow. So we took the data to the managers and we said, here you go. It doesn't get any better than this. And they said, sorry, it won't work. Fishermen won't do it. And I can't tell you how discouraging that was, because I was thinking, this is like the perfect data set. It doesn't get better than that.
Yeah.
So then we started giving talks at sport fishing clubs and talking to fishers, thinking, well, at least maybe they'd be interested. And it turns out they were. And then it turns out that they started doing the practice of recompressing fish. And then it turns out they started going to managers saying, why aren't we getting credit for this? So that for me was an eye opener, because what it showed me was that I was doing science for the wrong people. I thought my science was for managers that were trying to manage a fishery. Turns out, no, I need to be doing science for the public, because they're the ones who actually are the ones being regulated. So they want to know whether those regulations are going to work or not. So I had to find ways to get that science out to enough fishers who would pay attention. And believe me, I had to convince them that the data were real. And I had some really fun ways of doing that.
And you were invited across the country in some form, right, to speak to these people who were of the public, people of the public who wanted to learn more, right? So you had to be, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you had to be a little bit more savvy with speaking to the public. You had to learn to be.
I did, and it's interesting. Like other parts of the world, you get very different attitudes about conservation in different parts of the U.S. And, in some places it's California is a very conservation oriented, environmental protection sort of oriented community. And then you get to other places like in the Southeast and in the Gulf, and they're not so much. So, I was a little concerned about how fishers would respond to some of these practices that we were doing in California. And they would go, oh, those crazy Californians, they're tree huggers sort of things. But I was amazed at how well they recognized the problem and how they saw how that same solution that we were developing in California could be applied in the Gulf, or could be applied off Florida, could be applied off the East Coast.
Sure.
So because it didn't have to be the same species, they saw the same problem with the species they like to catch and they like to sell or eat. So they saw in our data a solution. I had to be able to translate that in a way that they would understand and appreciate. And that took a little practice.
Back to sharks. Share like a very light story. When I was a kid, I mean, I don't think this is anything particularly unique, but I remember the class more or less being split between boys and girls. Girls, when we were talking about animals of the ocean, our favorite animals of the ocean, girls love dolphins and the boys seem to like sharks. It was like one of those things. Again, we're talking like 70s, right? Early 80s. Yep. The only whale that I liked was the one that had the word killer in front of it, because it was a predator, right? That's it. It had teeth.
Right.
But I remember this, but I remember dolphins being boring because they were like people. Which in fact should have been exciting for me.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So killer whales and dolphins, you just use those as an example.
Yep.
They're fascinating to me because they do act like human beings. Like there's a sentience there that's very palpable. You can see it.
Yep.
And how they work in groups and how they cooperate, how they play together, how they train their young. It's marvelous. And sharks, you don't get to see that, but there is a mystery there for me. There's a mystery there that
Yep.
is indicative of the fact that maybe the sentience is there and I don't get it until you said to me, they are cognitive animals.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never heard anybody say that. I mean, I know it's not novel. You're a guy steeped in it. Stupid question. How do you know that they're cognitive beings?
Yeah, so the thing that we're starting to learn, so with dolphins, the reason why we can figure that out is because we have the ability to train them, keep them in captivity. We know how they communicate. We even know we can even decode some of their language. And with AI now, actually, there's serious talk about us being able to communicate directly with them.
Amazing.
Because it's truly a language, right? In the case of sharks, it's a little different. First of all, they're not nearly as social. They certainly aren't communicating in the same way. However, they do have body language. They do communicate much the same way other animals do to other animals. You know when a shark is pissed off, and the thing is that they convey a body language that we didn't evolve with them, but we can still kind of see and go, that animal doesn't look right, or that animal seems agitated, and that's evolved that way for a purpose. So that helps the animal avoid getting into conflict. But one of the things we're starting to learn as we have better technology, like we can now put transmitters on sharks that tell us every motion they make. If you've got accelerometers, we can measure their heart rate, we can measure their tail beat, how fast they're swimming, body temperature, what their stomach pH is, how recently have they fed. So there's all this new technology that's giving us insight into the behaviors, right? So what we're beginning to learn is that they're decision-making animals. Like when presented with different types of stimuli, they make decisions. And the questions that we're interested in now that our technology is getting better, is how quickly do they learn? How long do they retain that information from? How quickly does that information get passed on to other individuals? So we do see evidence of sharks learning from each other. So, for example, we see unique behaviors like we see with orca, like with killer whales, right? So there are some that specialize in just eating salmon. Then there's some that specialize in just eating marine mammals, seals and dolphins. Then there's some that now specialize in just eating sharks. So we start to see this kind of decision-making process, this learning process in sharks. It's just not nearly as developed. And what's really interesting is when you start looking at their brains, you can see why. Huge difference. Like dolphin and orca brains are larger than ours. Because their brains are so much larger than ours, some people think that they actually might have even comparable cognitive activities to us.
In sharks instead?
Not so much. Not deep thinkers. They're not writing any sonnets. They're not writing any complex algorithms. But their evolutionary prowess, right? So they've been around as a group for 400 million years. So obviously they've been doing something right.
Right. So they've been doing something right. So you told me that they've survived 5 major mass extinctions.
Yeah.
So doing something right means you're aware.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we don't understand their language or starting to because of people like you. What is it that here's the question. What hunch do you have that they are aware of something that you didn't think they were until now through your work?
Yeah. So we have some really interesting examples of that. So I've worked with some fishermen in Hawaii. They're trap fishermen. So they'd fish with traps and they would go out every day and throw their old bait out of their traps. And the sharks would show up. So these sharks, as soon as they would get there, before they even started to pull their traps, the sharks would be gathering around their boat. So this fisherman was telling me it's really interesting. I could go out and he'd rev his engine, it slows his boat down to pick up a trap. Sharks would be there. So he had a problem with his boat. It turns out his engine died. He had to replace his engine. So he went out as soon as his engine was replaced to the same spots and no sharks. So then it took about 2 or 3 weeks before the sharks began to recognize it was his engine. So then I asked him, well, when you're out fishing, was there anybody else around you? And he said, yeah, there'd always be people. There was another group that would take people snorkeling a little while over. I said, well, they ever see sharks? He said, no. So I said, well, that's interesting. It sounds like the sharks could recognize the sound of your engine. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly what he thought it was. And when he changed engines, same boat, same practice, same place, sharks didn't recognize him. And of course, there were all these other boats around that were creating noise, but there wasn't a reward that came with the noise.
Right.
So what was interesting was the sharks had to relearn that there's a new sound that's now associated with I'm going to get a treat when this guy shows up. Mm-hmm. So that's one. And then there's another. We were doing work on tiger sharks in Hawaii. And there's a group of tiger sharks at this one place that love to eat albatross chicks. So these albatross, they're massive birds, 6-foot wingspans, and the babies make their first flights over the water. Now, albatross are really cool birds. They can spend years out at sea. So these birds would get ready, they're flapping their wings, their pin feathers are gone. They've really got their full feathers and they're getting ready to make their first flights. In this small lagoon, there would be 6 or 8 large tiger sharks waiting for those chicks to try to make their first flight. And if they hit the water, the sharks would just nail them and scarf them down. So we called it Thanksgiving. It was tiger shark Thanksgiving. Scarfing down
sea turkeys.
Exactly. So, but what was really cool was I would say within 2 days of the last bird fledging, sharks left and they were gone for the rest of the year. Now, what's really cool is that fledging season is amazingly predictable, like within a week. So the next year, all the sharks that we tagged that were there showed up exactly 1 week before the first bird fledged. All of them.
Wow. All of them. All the ones that you tagged.
Yeah. And then they would feed on those birds until the last bird left. And then off they would go. Some of those sharks went all the way down the main Hawaiian Islands. Some of them went all the way up to the northern part of the islands. But 1 week before that fledging season, they would be right back at that little lagoon. So think about it. Think about the ability to learn how to do that. Not all tiger sharks do this. Just some have learned how to do this. Some of them are better than others. But the clock in their head, how do they know?
So precise.
How do they exactly? So when you think about those things, they have, first of all, huge survival benefits, being able to retain and learn that information. But it really gives us insight into these animals aren't mindless by no means. They're not these mindless eating machines. They're very picky and very conscientious eating machines.
Yeah, and they hone in very specifically on I like, what do I know? Again, but very specifically on patterns that'll give them the maximum amount of return.
Yes, and they can learn that information really quickly, which is, to me, amazing, right? And the trick is, how do we figure these things out? So that's always been the fun part for me, is finding what tool or technology can we use to determine how quickly they can learn these things. And it's not like some little, shark array that you can keep in a tank in a lab and you can present it, train it to, identify shapes and things like that. Researchers have done that. And they learn very quickly. But what about something like a tiger shark or a white shark or a mako shark or a cookie cutter shark?
The cookie cutter. We'll get to the cookie cutter. Is there a question here that just occurred to me? Have you seen sharks? Have you studied sharks behaving towards something in this manner that wasn't food?
So it's really interesting. We see something very similar in young sharks, very young sharks. And they remind me of children. So when kids are learning, they stick everything in their mouth, right? That's part of that
Yep.
investigation sort of thing to understand what things are. They have to touch them. They have to reach out and feel them. They stick them in their mouth. We see young sharks doing the same thing with inanimate objects. They'll play with kelp. They'll play with trash, unfortunately. They'll play with all this stuff at the surface. And it very much reminds me of a kid, playing with objects and learning how to manipulate them and what it is based on its feel and its taste. So, I think that sort of thing is we see it in sharks, and not just certain species, pretty much all of them.
Juvenile sharks.
Yeah. So there's that exploratory part. And remember, there's no parental care in sharks.
Right. Solitary.
Females give birth and the babies are on their own. So they have to figure out everything on their own. And there's probably a fair bit of instinct there. There are things that they respond to that tells them, okay, this is food. But after that, learning how to catch it, how to manipulate it, how to eat it, how to find it, all of that is learned.
Have you ever been friends with a shark?
I don't know if you could say it friends, but the ones that I've spent the most amount of time with, you do recognize individuals. Some individuals will come closer to you than others, especially if you're feeding them. We try not to do that, but sometimes, we'd have sharks come to the boat and it would be the same shark over and over again because they know it's an easy meal. And then, we're already seeing these sorts of trends in other fish. So there appears to be even some genetic component to this. In other words, shyness and boldness might actually be genetically driven.
Shyness and boldness genetically driven. And is that something that you're in the midst of proving, or can you prove it?
Well, there are a number of researchers out there looking for this because we see this across a lot of populations. And the reason why shyness and boldness both work evolutionarily is because there are advantages to being bold. There are equally advantages to being shy. So, and that's why we think those two behaviors might be genetically retained and passed on. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be modified. Those behaviors can't be modified and changed with experience and practice and things like that. But there may be an underlying genetic component to it. So we see that sort of thing in sharks. There's some that will come right up. They tend to have the most scars on them and tend to be the most beat up ones. And then you get those that are really beautiful, no scars, no marks on them. Yeah. And they kind of keep their distance, they're being very cautious. So, it's interesting to see how this carries through so many different animals.
Have you ever been injured getting close to them studying?
No, that's the goal. That's the goal.
That's the goal.
Yeah. One rule in the lab, do not get bitten. Because a little bite does a lot of damage. So we spend a lot of time looking at safety and practicing and making sure the animals are safe and we're safe. But all the time that I've spent in the water, there are times when I do kind of feel things are amping up. In other words, behaviors are getting a little excited. And then I wisely back out of the water, get out of the water.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that's just experience. Being around the animals,
right? Because you mentioned earlier an agitated shark. Like, how do you know a shark is agitated if you don't have experience swimming with them? That's why I asked.
Yeah, so I think those are things that you recognize over time. With terrestrial animals, we have co-evolved with them. So, for example, cats and dogs, you can tell when a cat and dog is mad, right? Yeah. They'll growl. Their tail will be down, their ears should be back. If you're an observant person, you will go, that's not a happy animal. And that is actually what we call an agonistic display. So it's a warning, right? And if you back off, quite often that behavior subsides, right? But if you continue to persist, quite often that behavior will break out and involve a bite. The animal will defend itself. So the thing is humans, we co-evolve with those animals, so we more easily recognize those behaviors. And it was my predecessor, Don Nelson, who was the first to figure out that sharks actually had a body language that was analogous to that.
I'm going to ask you a stupid question, but what is up with hammerhead sharks? Those are the most alien-looking animal on the planet, part of the planet. I think I'm more terrified of that thing than anything else. Yeah, why a head like that?
They're truly bizarre, right? I mean, and there's about 9 species, and they all have different head shapes,
Hmm.
ranging anywhere from the wing head, where its head is about a third of the length of its body, and it's very long. It looks like a boomerang with a
Yeah.
tail, and all the way down to something we call the bonnet head, which is like a little spade. So, the big debate was, what evolved first? So we thought that they evolved from sharks, and it turns out that true is actually the more ancestral of the group. And then they went to a more narrower head. So, evolution has all these cool tricks. So, those 5 major extinction
Yes.
events,
Yeah.
so that this is, kind of like radiant evolution. So we see things radiate really quickly after these mass extinction events. And that's something that, I've always been really fascinated about with sharks, right? One of the things that I find most fascinating is something like a white shark's genome is 6 times larger than ours.
And what does that mean?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. So it's carrying a lot of junk DNA, right? Or that's what we assume. But what if some of that junk DNA has been the key to their evolutionary success? In other words, under past times, under certain conditions, they actually possess within them the genes that would enable them to adapt to new conditions. So are sharks the cockroaches of the underwater world? In other words, they seem to have the capacity to withstand incredible extinction events where 90% of life on oceans was lost, but clearly theirs was retained and then radiated again. So is it hidden in their DNA? So I'm not a geneticist, but I find that fascinating.
Well, it sounds really fascinating. I wish I had the scientific pedigree to follow up on questions that I should. I feel like right now that I can't.
Well, me too. Me too.
You
It's a
too. Yeah,
fascinating
nice,
topic, but it's not
nice.
my field. Um, but it's here are these animals that have been around for 400 million years.
Hmm.
Why on earth would their genomes be so large and so much larger than ours? We're so complex. So 6 times larger.
What the hell do they know? What do they know that we don't? What do
Exactly.
they sense? Well, it's like cats. Anybody who has a cat has I, anybody I know who has a cat has told me 100% of people who have a cat have told me that their cats sense things around them that we can't see,
Oh yeah.
touch, feel. Uh, how do we know that sharks aren't the same? Sharks maybe are the felines of the sea.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So what's really cool, studies have been done that show that they'll leave bays before hurricanes and before tropical storms. Like literally an hour before the storm hits, they'll leave. All of them.
And,
So
and that's indigenous to sharks, not to
well,
other.
we don't necessarily see it in other fish. It may exist in other fish, but in sharks that have been tagged, all these tagged sharks, like an hour before the storm hits, they all go offshore. So how do they know? Well, what we do know is barometric pressure drops really fast as these tropical depressions or hurricanes roll in. And
Mhm.
it's possible that they have the capability to detect that change and it drives them to leave, even for like newborn sharks.
Wow.
So think about the instinct. How would they know? And then where do they know to go? Are they following other sharks or do they just know? So, man, too many cool things.
Yeah. Well, so it's almost frightening to answer that question with, "Wow, they're just beautiful machines," because then they're just machines. But then, if they're just machines, who the hell built a machine like that?
Exactly. Well, evolution built that machine, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Why?
so
Why those machines? Why those
exactly,
guys?
exactly.
Why the most terrifying looking ones?
Yeah, yeah. So keep in mind, it's like Windows 11 version with now.
Oh, that's great. What single mystery of a shark would you like to find out before you die?
Man, that is tough. There's so many. We've got this Greenland shark that lives to maybe 400 years
Oh,
old.
yeah, that's right.
So how do they do that? So one theory is that when you live in really cold conditions, everything slows down.
Hmm.
So all your enzymes slow down, which means aging slows down. So, but those animals in particular can get really large. And what's really cool, I call them that they're like the antithesis white shark. They're the opposite version. They get really big and they eat seals. And that was a mystery. Nobody can figure out how this really slow moving giant potato of a shark is taking down seals. And their trick might be being the opposite of a white shark. White sharks are warm bodied, they're fast, everything moves at hyper speed, super powerful. They can chase those things down, right? But sleeper sharks, and that's what they're called, might actually use the opposite. They move so slowly, the seals can't feel them coming. That to me is just so cool.
I want to be
Like
a
there's
sleeper.
another solution to the problem, but it's the opposite solution, right? Instead of moving super fast and trying to figure out what this highly mobile thing is going to do, you just creep up on them so slowly they can't feel you coming.
And you live 400 or 500 years.
Exactly. And one meal might last you 8 months.
Imagine the wisdom. Imagine the wisdom collected.
Exactly. Exactly.
He eats big, but he eats slow.
Exactly. Yeah.
Moves slow.
Yep. So that intermediate fasting really pays off for them.
He figured it out hundreds of years before we did. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Cool. Very cool. This has been a very cool conversation, Chris. Thank you. I guess the last question, what is greatness to you?
I think for me, it really comes to when I meet people that I think are great, they're people who think differently. And you know, it's weird because our society treats people that think differently unfairly, I think. But it's people who look at things from a different perspective. And it's the creativity that comes from that. Sometimes it's not always popular. It's amazing how many brilliant things that have propelled the human race forward that were unpopular ideas at one point and turned out to be revolutionary. That I think is greatness. The people who persist and keep going and have the resilience despite the backlash they might get from what are considered to be kind of crazy ideas. I think that's greatness. The ability to just keep going even when people are saying that's nuts.
I would agree. That's certainly something we should all strive for because it's all within us. Like that capability is within everybody. It's not even special.
Yeah, and I think we need to encourage people to let it out. You know,
Yeah.
people are inhibited by that, right? And I think you know, having the confidence to let that out. This is something I push my students to do, right? You know, think outside the box. You might have the next big idea, but you gotta voice it. So stop feeling so conscious about those things and let it ride. And the whole idea, you know, is to try to get students bouncing ideas off each other and for them to see if they can figure out which one holds, which means you got to be able to back it up with something. And just because you don't have the ammunition to back it up now doesn't mean you won't later. You might have to do a bit more homework, right? So I think that's the thing that greatness is in everybody, but we need to be more tolerant of people for one thing. And we need to just listen. And I think if we do that, greatness is all around us.
I can't stop thinking about, as you were explaining this, I couldn't stop thinking about the Greenland shark, the sleeper shark, because that's how that shark behaves. I mean, you could make the connections, right? Sorry, this is the last question before I let you go, because I promised you we'd get back to that particular shark. I had asked you off record what your favorite shark was because I was just interested, and then you gave me something that I didn't even know about. What's your favorite shark?
It's a cookie cutter. I don't even have to think about it. Yeah, they're amazing, right? They're these little sharks, less than 2 feet long. They have the largest tooth to body length ratio of any vertebrate, and they take little ice cream scoop bites out of everything. Literally everything. Whales, dolphins, white shark faces. Occasionally, on rare occasion, people, they piss the Navy off all the time because they take bites out of their submarine hydrophones. But there are these amazing animals we know virtually nothing about. Every 9-year-old kid knows what a cookie cutter shark is, but to the scientific world, we know virtually nothing about them. And they make their living out of just taking a little bite.
And going back home.
They don't need to eat the whole animal. They just need a little bite.
Wow. Wow. So when you first told me, I went to research on this thing, and I've been infatuated with this shark. So thank you for that education too. And the reminder of that sleeper shark. I can't believe I forgot that one. Wow.
So the sleeper shark's just on the other end of the spectrum of a cookie cutter.
Chris, again, I can't thank you enough, man. It was fun. It was fun. Thanks for the education.
I appreciate it. It's been a treat.